Okay, before we look at examples where we have to calculate the mean and standard deviation before constructing a confidence interval, let's do a quick review on how to calculate the mean and standard deviation. And so what I have here is a small data set, okay, and what we're going to do is we're going to calculate the mean and standard deviation. For the standard deviation, we're going to use the computation formula. So this is actually the better formula to use because it eliminates any rounding error in the intermediate calculations. It's actually easier to do as well. So let's review that here. So if you remember the mean, the formula for that is it's just the sum of the x values divided by n. And n is the sample size. Okay. S here, using the computation formula, is the sum of x squared minus the sum of x quantity squared over n. All of this divided by n minus 1. And then we take the square root of all of that. Okay, and that was the computation formula for calculating the standard deviation. Okay, so if we're going to calculate the mean and standard deviation for this data set, we're going to need the sum of x, we're going to need the sum of x squared right there, and we're going to need n. Okay, so n here is just the number of values, so n is 6. Okay, if you remember, the sum of x is just adding up the values. I can probably do that in my head. There's 10. That would be 28. So the sum of x is 28. Okay. Now if you remember, the sum of x squared is actually, you got to square each value first and then add up the squares. So I could do it on my calculator like this. So basically, if you look at my calculator here, what I've done is I've squared each value individually and I'm adding them up. And this gives me 174. Okay. So these are the numbers that go into these formulas over here. So the sum of x, the mean is the sum of x over n. So the sum of x is 28. 28 over 6. Okay, so 28 divided by 6. Doesn't come out evenly there, so I'm going to round this to 1 decimal place. If you remember the rounding rule, you go to 1 more decimal place than the data that's in the data set. So these are all to the ones place. So I'm going to go to the tenths place, and that would be 4.7. So that's my mean. And now for S, here I'm going to use this formula. So we have the sum of x squared, which is 174, minus this sum of x here, that quantity squared. So that would be 28 squared. And I don't need the parentheses there because I've already summed it up. And then I'm going to divide that by n, which is 6. Okay, and then I'm going to take that whole thing and divide it by 6 minus 1. And then I take the square root of all of that. So that's how you would write it out. Okay. So to put it in the calculator, do this in 3 steps. So if you remember, I said do the top first. And then the second step is divide the answer by the bottom. And then the third step is to take the square root of the answer. Right? And so do it in those 3 steps. Don't try to put all this in your calculator at once. Okay, so here's how you would do it. 174 minus 28 squared divided by 6. Okay. And then you hit equal, and that's the top. So notice when I put this in, I don't need any parentheses or whatever, because it'll do the order of operations. It'll square the 28, divide by 6, and then subtract the 2. That's what you want it to do. So now I divide by 5. I'll do the minus 1 in my head. Divide by 5. And I get that. And if you remember, that's what's underneath the radical. That's the variance. So then I take the square root of the answer. And then I hit equals. And I get 2.9. Okay. So there is my mean and standard deviation, and then if I were to construct a confidence interval, I could go through and do the rest of the problem. It's just I'm having to calculate the mean and standard deviation on my own. Okay? So if you have a written test where you have to write all this out, I'm not sure well, let's just say if I want to actually see all your work, if you had this much work, then I would be satisfied here. Okay? So what I want to see is that you can get these sums, you know what those sums are and you can get them, and that you can put the sums into the formula and then get the answer. You don't need any more than what you see right there. That's what I would want. I mean, you don't need this either, just this right here. Okay? Now there's also a way of getting these sums on our calculators, and here, this is the only one that I have. This is the one I kind of recommend for this class. So let me just give you the example on here real quick. Your calculator would probably be different, but we did it earlier in the semester. You may remember how to do that. If you don't, you could probably refresh by watching a YouTube video or whatever. There's probably a lot of videos that tell you how to use your particular calculator. But for this one, you have to clear everything. And there's a clear right up here. This is the mode button. So I hit shift and then that button. Then I hit 3 to clear all. So now it's clear. So now I hit the mode button and I hit 2 for statistical data. And now I can put these values in my calculator by hitting the number, typing in the number, and then hitting this M plus button. And it'll say n equals 1. There's n equals 2. And then n equals 3, n equals 4, n equals 5, n equals 6. So now all my data is in there. For this one, then, you hit Shift 1, and then you hit Shift 1, and then you get these choices. So if I hit 2, I can get the sum of x, and then Shift 1, and if I hit 1, I can get the sum of x squared. Okay, so you don't have to write these sums out. If you put the data in your calculator and you get the sums that way, that is fine. I just want to see the individual sums, and I want to see those sums put into the formula with n. Okay, so that's how you calculate the mean and standard deviation. So in the next video, we're going to apply all of this to an actual problem where we're given the sample, and then it wants us to construct a confidence interval.